something that you can, do in half an hour. It took days for him to do it because he had to go to every other place that he had signed into using his Facebook account. He had to cut all of those ties before they would actually allow him to close his account. So it took something like 4 days, I think he said. But yeah, I mean, for me, he's not only an online artist, he's become an online activist as well. And that's where our new problem is going to be, I think, our generation. I mean, as you were saying, privacy is changing, and once that catches up to us and we realize the implications of giving out our information to whoever and whenever, for whatever purposes, we're going to have a real problem on our hands.
And there's actually a really growing movement of people quitting Facebook as sort of a political thing.
Yeah.
And are they substituting something?
In some cases.
I mean, just to throw this out, also, there was a site before Facebook called MySpace.
Yeah, I remember MySpace back in the day.
That everybody quit.
Right. But I mean, the thing about MySpace was you were allowed to, you had the freedom, sort of Android versus Google, Android versus Apple. You could create that space to represent whatever you wanted it to be. It could be super messy and it wasn't always formatted right. That's kind of what got. I mean,
there was Friendster before that.
Friendster as well, but I mean, MySpace was really popular because you could make it represent, and artists, a lot of artists still use it. They make it represent, whatever they're doing. They can customize it to make it their own personal space. But that's specifically what upset a lot of people because they felt like it was too messy. Like Facebook is formatted for them. So.
Well, I mean, what was interesting to me, I mean, the other night, Ricky, you posted the TED Talk on your Facebook wall. And it was like, it's such a paradox because the only way that we're going to be able to fight against it is using that platform, So that to me is there's a huge tension there.
So that sort of ties back against this idea of the private and the public and the virtual space and the physical space and there's all of that. I don't think that there's any accident that this issue is coming up sort of in physical places like graffiti and like all of that because of all of this other thing. It's making people think about their spaces, like their combined spaces, in different ways. And they're being more purposeful about the ways in which they want to have the online versus, the public versus the private. Are you on the way out?
I am.
I was just going to get you to ask you to talk about your Afrofuturism pitch. Do you have time to do that, or do you need to run?
I can do it really. I have to
do it really
review something
fast
for the Village Voice.
Okay, really fast. She got a gig.
Yeah, I'm reviewing a Japanese movie for the
Good
Village
for
Voice.
you.
Wow. Thank you. Afrofuturism. So.
Sorry, I didn't.
I should have.
You were on my next call list.
Okay. I'm sorry. I don't.
Yeah.
Where do we begin? I've been covering contemporary art from Texas mostly for the last 5 years, and a trend I've seen. I first saw it when a traveling show from Los Angeles came to San Antonio called Phantom Sightings. And it was contemporary Chicano and Chicana artists, kind of my age and younger. I'm 41. And there was a lot of nods to Afrofuturism in particular, which began in the 1950s with musicians like Sun Ra positing a future space or an outer space in which slavery had never happened, in which the colonial experience had never happened, and what would that look like? What would this utopian version of humanity post-race, post-colonialism mean? And it was kind of as post-colonialism was happening in academia, but it was more accessible, and it affected everything from P-Funk to Philip K. Dick to Octavia Butler, a very noted African-American feminist, lesbian science fiction writer. And this has worked its way into contemporary art, especially as regards marginalized communities, or however you want to say it, queer, black, feminist, and Mexican American. I'm seeing artists both in South Texas, where I'm from, and in this area engage in this vision of futurism. It affects aesthetics, it's kind of, they're constructing their own worlds. Like, we know all the baggage that's oppressed us. Is there an aesthetic way to address beyond that? Is there a way to go to beyond that?
So can you...
With regard to Los Angeles, yes?
So can you boil this down into an elevator pitch?
In Los Angeles, which is such a hotbed both of these communities and this kind of futuristic thinking, this utopia, what kind of art is being made? How is this contested space of the future being done in art? Not with regard to access to art, not with regard to education about art, not with regard to, but within the contemporary art making itself. Who's making art that addresses this, and what are the worlds that they are making?
Okay.
So actually, you in your own, you said it succinctly, I think. How are contemporary artists overtaking the future as a contested space?
Right.
So looking at all elements of science fiction and all sorts of things, but the future as a contested space. And it's got some really interesting implications there.
And artists are addressing this over and over in lots of different ways, in lots of different media. And in Los Angeles, there seems to be a particular...
So the other piece of, which you didn't go into in your pitch, but I think is an interesting in terms of the tool that you're looking at,
Right.
is to look at San Antonio and Los Angeles and maybe choose, 6
few
artists
artists,
in
yeah.
a place who are dealing with these, and she was calling it Sala, so it's like a room, but it's San Antonio and Los Angeles with a tool that allows these people to converse between and among and looking at this one very specific
Right.
thing.
So it would
Which
be a
is
package.
15 pages for you to tell. No.
It's hard to, there's a nut graph, but there's a lot of context, you know what I mean? And I was under the impression that we were to do 500 words on each thing.
It's okay. And it's fascinating documents on Afrocentrism and things like that.
Okay.
I got Lupe Fiasco song. Right.
Oh, what?
It's a Lupe Fiasco song. I'll send it to you later. Go to your gig.
I still didn't catch it. Okay.
He's going to send you a song.
Sarah, I can, if there are questions about yours, I feel like I know we've had.
Thank you. Yeah, we had a discussion yesterday, and my pitch, it's hard to pitch that, so I just,
Yesterday?
yeah. All right, see y'all later.
Bye.
Have a great one. Good luck.
Just going back to the discussion about murals and public art, we just did a piece a couple of weeks ago. I can send a link around to it about this guy who does. It's about graffiti art, for lack of a better term. This artist doing sort of graffiti or mural type art for private businesses, basically doing advertising for them with the consent of the businesses. This is in LA too, and this one particular guy, he works to create what are called free zones, where businesses in a particular area will say, if someone wants to come along and do up my wall,
Use this as a
fine.
campus.
and it is technically illegal, but basically what Kevin Ferguson in the story found is that it's like way down the priority list for the LAPD. They're not spending their time for this sort of thing. So it is actually going on, even though technically it's illegal.
Yeah, yeah.
So I can send the link to this.
That's
Yeah,
great.
that would be
It's really
great.
interesting.
Yeah. That's very cool. Okay, we need to move on to the next.
Can we take a 5 minute?
5 minutes? Yeah, 5 minutes.
Right. 5 minute break.
The 5 minutes.
And anybody who doesn't, where restrooms are, I'm going to hear.
About there.